What if you couldn't get disaster assistance or disaster grants if a federal disaster like a flood happened? It'd be devastating, wouldn't it? Well, in today's video, we're showing you how some things are changing at the federal level that could have a big impact potentially on how you get disaster assistance and disaster funding, and why flood insurance plays such a vital role now. So let's get started. But before we do, make sure to share, subscribe, and like the channel below. Hi, I'm Chris with the Flood Insurance Guru, and more than a decade ago, I bought a house in a flood zone. I was given the wrong information by my insurance agent. My realtor didn't know what to do. My lender wasn't really sure what to do. My loan closing almost fell apart. And that's why I've been helping property owners like yourself avoid these issues for more than a decade now. Today, we're talking about this new AI action plan and also the actions by the federal government to start to roll back support for disaster assistance and disaster funding in a lot of different areas, and what impact it could have on you as a property owner. So first of all, let's talk about the first step, which was the government's ultimate goal was to roll back some disaster assistance and not give as much disaster funding or disaster assistance. Headed into hurricane season, this could have a big impact in areas like Florida, Louisiana, Texas, where a lot of these people get devastated by storms. What does it mean for recovering these areas? What does it potentially mean for you as a homeowner when it comes to getting flood insurance? So in rolling these back, the government was trying to make it harder and harder to get disaster assistance or disaster recovery funds. They're trying to put more and more on the states, where the state has to take more responsibility here. This means that getting disaster assistance could be harder to qualify for. You may not get as much after a disaster, which means that flood insurance is going to play an even more vital role. Look, flood insurance should always be your first level of protection as a homeowner. Whether you're in a high-risk flood zone, a low-risk flood zone, you can check your flood risk score below. But it's important to understand that, and looking at this, that's always going to be your first level of defense. Depending on something that's disaster assistance as a last effort, kind of like an SBA disaster loan. If you can get it, great, but insurance should always be your first defense. But using that flood risk score to determine, hey, could my property actually flood or not? Remember, every property has a potential flooding. Let's just look at what happened in Texas. It's how much rain they got, how fast. That you get parts of Texas where buildings were just completely washed away. You had the same thing happen after Helene in North Carolina. You've had the same thing happen in Birmingham, Alabama, Nashville, Tennessee. It's happening more and more as more and more severe storms are hitting non-coastal areas. As this starts to happen, which means the need for flood insurance is becoming higher and higher, especially with land development, government regulation changing, and harder and harder to get that. What does that potentially mean for your national flood insurance program policy? Does it mean it could take longer for funds to pay out? Potentially. Could that mean that there's less red tape with private flood insurance? Absolutely, if private flood insurance is available in your area. But it's not that easy. When working with a flood insurance agent near you, you want to remember to ask certain questions like, what's the 3-year track record of this private flood insurance company? How quick do they pay out claims and things like this? So it absolutely could be a quicker process, but it may not be, because you want to get the answer to those questions. Look, we have, in helping more than 2,000 homeowners with their flood insurance the last few years, we have seen some private companies that take longer to pay on claims. We've seen some private companies that just create a terrible experience for the customer, where the National Flood Insurance Program is actually a better option. That's why when we set someone up with a private policy, we're not just looking at rates. We're looking at how they handle claims. We're looking at how they handle service. What's the track record look like? So those are all things that are important to understand there when asking those questions, when looking at this government. Now, the next thing that could play a big role is this new AI action plan, where the government is trying to cut back on government regulation in order to advance AI development and to kind of keep pushing forward in that AI race. So what does that potentially mean for flood insurance? Well, this could also potentially have another big impact, because one of the things they're looking at is they don't want states to regulate AI. And those that do, it may be harder for them to get funding. It may take longer for them to get funding. Does this mean your disaster assistance is going to get declined? Probably not. Does it mean potentially it could take longer with flood sharing? Possibly. We just really don't know. But once again, this is why we should be using disaster assistance as a last resort. We should be using flood insurance as the first level of defense. But you see, using flood insurance as a first level of defense isn't even enough there. We've got to understand, what is the replacement cost of our property? What is the actual cost? What it would actually take to rebuild this thing? And this is what we see from helping so many homeowners. Is about 60% of the time, properties are uninsured because people are just insuring them for what the bank requires. And so that's why you need to have the proper replacement cost on there. That might mean having what's called a primary flood insurance policy, and that might mean having an excess flood insurance policy. Remember, an excess flood insurance policy is going to be a policy that's on top of that primary policy. That could be a national flood insurance program policy. That could be a private policy. But what happens is it goes up to that $250, and then the excess kicks in after you've exceeded that policy. So it's important to understand that as these government regulations change and it becomes harder and harder to get disaster assistance, not just understand that you have flood insurance, but that you have the right flood insurance and you have the right amount of flood insurance. Also, as you go through this, remember, flood insurance works differently than home insurance or auto insurance. It typically means you're going to have a different deductible for each one of these coverages. So when you're picking your home insurance or your flood insurance, make sure not to pick a crazy deductible at $10,000, because potentially you could have a $30,000 deductible if you're not careful. And this is where people really get in trouble, where they become disappointed, become claims times because their deductibles are so high. So pick a deductible that you feel comfortable with as a homeowner. So that's what we wanted to talk about in today's videos. How are these things going to impact it? And what you can use as your defense. So remember, before we let you go for the day, in the description down below, you can download our guide to flood insurance, understanding the National Flood Insurance Program, understanding private flood insurance. We built this guide exactly for you. You can also use calculator down below to determine how much flood insurance do you actually need on your property. It's easy. Put your property address in there, and you'll have that answer in about 60 seconds. I'm Chris with the Flood Insurance Guru, and I want to say thank you for watching today's video. Remember, everybody's in a flood zone. It's just a matter of how fast it takes water to get to you. Thank you.